Evening guys, welcome to another session with me, doing your kind of topic summaries for the AQA Psychology A-Level. So as promised from the previous couple of videos, this is the last of the paper 1 topics, which is attachment. Now, as you can see, there's not actually that much written on the little whiteboard this evening, and that's purely because I physically couldn't fit it on. So I've just kind of kept the visual to a minimum, and as always I'm going to talk through the essential points. I will also put kind of on our online platforms, on Teams, kind of all of the mind map versions of these summaries on PowerPoint that are a lot more detailed, that you can use alongside these videos as a bit of a revision guidance. So attachment is probably one of the biggest topics, arguably on the whole course, but definitely within paper 1. So I'm going to try and keep this relatively brief and not go into as much detail about each section, because there is a lot of information, and instead just give you an overview of the key terms and make reference to the key studies, but kind of point you in the direction of where you might want to do some additional reading. So if we start off first of all with what we call caregiver-infant interactions, so this is essentially the key premise that attachment is a bond that's an emotional connection between you and a significant other. Now, predominantly this topic refers to the attachment bond between an infant and their caregivers, so looking at children and their parents and the bonds that they create in those early years and how that then later affects your friendships and adult relationships in future. So within the kind of section of caregiver-infant interactions, there's a few different things that kind of come under this specification bullet point. So you first of all got 2 key terms called reciprocity and interactional synchrony. So reciprocity is this idea that the interactions that caregivers and infants have need to be reciprocated, that this is a 2-way process, so very much like turn taking and having a conversation, and that by doing these caregiver-infant interactions, this is going to help form and maintain that attachment bond by building that kind of sense of rapport between the caregiver and the infant. So for example, reciprocity would be if an infant cries and a mother feeds it, that's them responding sensitively to the baby's needs, and it's kind of turn taking like a conversation. You do one thing and I respond to that behaviour, the baby elicits a response and the caregiver reacts appropriately. Whereas interactional synchrony is about doing things at the same time. So when the infant and caregiver are very much synchronized in their behaviours, and this is more of the concept of mirroring. So for example, if baby smiles at you and you smile back at the same time, that kind of mimicking of those facial expressions is helping build that communication with your infant, which is really essential during those early years. So reciprocity and interactional synchrony are just 2 examples of caregiver-infant interactions that you could be asked about. In terms of key researchers or names that go alongside this, you've got research by Jaffe for reciprocity, and then for interactional synchrony, you've got Meltzoff and Moore. So they did observational research looking at the extent to which infants and caregivers would mirror that behaviour, and how those facial expressions and gestures could be copied from a really, really young age, and showed a sign that an attachment had been formed. Now, following on from that, you've got the work of Schaefer and Emerson, who looked at the 4 main stages of attachment. So to start off with, you've got pre-attachment. So this is kind of in the birth to 6 weeks, the first few weeks of life, where we don't really have this innate bond yet developed, and our interactions between kind of objects like a teddy bear, for example, isn't that much different to how we would react to our actual caregiver. Next, you've got the indiscriminate phase from kind of 6 weeks kind of up to approximately kind of 7 months. That next chunk of time in our development is when we start to become a lot more familiar with our caregivers, and we show a strong preference for human faces and find them a lot more comforting than inanimate objects. But we still don't really have that stranger anxiety developed, and we're easily soothed and comforted by everyone. So this tends to be when babies are really young and you can kind of pass them around different friends and family members, and they kind of are equally soothed by lots of people. The third stage is where there is kind of the most significant change in the development of attachment, and that's called the discriminate phase. So in the discriminate stage, this is where the infant actually starts to discriminate between familiar and unfamiliar adults. They show a strong preference for their main primary caregiver, which is usually the biological mother. And they experience a lot of stranger anxiety and separation anxiety, so they become very distressed when they are away from the caregiver or when a stranger is present. And then the fourth stage is multiple attachment. So Schaefer and Emerson categorise this as kind of 1 year plus, so 12 months onwards, where infants would start to show signs of attachment being formed to multiple other people, not just their primary caregiver. So for example, forming relationships with grandparents and siblings and other significant key adults in their life. And then finally, under this subheading, you've also got the role of the father. So this is looking at key research studies from Lamb or Field about the role of rough and tumble play, and that dad does play a significant role in attachment, but that the attachment bond is formed through different ways. Whereas Field says it's not necessarily the gender of the parent that's important. What's important in forming attachments is the level of responsiveness and how well those caregiver-infant interactions are displayed. So are you using reciprocity and interactional synchrony to communicate with your baby and to fulfill their needs? Following on from caregiver-infant interactions, you can talk about the use of animal studies. So this refers to kind of ways in which we can use ethology, so the study of animals in a natural habitat, and trying to apply and generalise that knowledge to humans. Now, obviously, there's lots of reasons why we use animal studies, mainly when we're trying to do something that otherwise would be too unethical to be allowed to be conducted on humans. However, there are significant problems with regards to that generalisation. So I would just be mindful, particularly when evaluating animal studies, that you think about those generalisations and what problems could arise if we just relied on the use of this methodology alone. So animal studies is quite simple in the sense that it's broken down into 2 key bullet points, that being Harlow and their study with rhesus monkeys, and then Lorenz and his study with geese. Now Harlow and Lorenz studies show very different or very opposing ideas about the context of attachment and the main thing that caused it, which feeds nicely into the booklet that we teach about explanations of attachment, which I'll come on to in a second. So in Harlow's study, Harlow concluded that the main thing that causes attachment is contact comfort opposed to food. So contact comfort is all about us building and forming an attachment with those that provide us with emotional support and comfort, as opposed to that biological aspect of feeding. So one of the key things that you need to know for both Harlow and Lorenz is you need to explicitly know what the IV and DV is in that study. Now, the reason for that is if you get asked a question on how animal studies have been used to study attachment, a how question is all about the method. It's about the process, and you need to be able to explain that procedure in a step-by-step format. One of the marks being explicitly state the IV and DV. You need those points for full marks. Alternatively, if the question is phrased as what do animal studies show about human attachment, you would have to state the findings, so just the results of the studies, and then try and link it to how well that can be generalised to a different population. So in Harlow's study, the explicit IV, or the thing that is changing, is whether or not the monkeys were in a cage with the wire mum having food or the cloth mother having food. Okay, so there were 16 monkeys in total, split up into 2 groups of 8. In each of the conditions, remember, both groups had 2 mothers, 2 surrogate mothers, a wire one and a cloth one. But the only thing that changed is which of the 2 mothers had the bottle of food attached. So in condition 1, there was a wire mum and a cloth mum. The wire mum was the one that had the milk bottle attached, so the wire produced food. In the other condition, again, they had a wire and a cloth surrogate mother, but it was the cloth one that had food. So that's the bit that's changing. Don't make the mistake and say whether there was a cloth or wire mother, because both conditions experience both surrogates, but who actually provided the food was what was being manipulated. And then in terms of what was measured for Harlow, you can either refer to the amount of time in hours and minutes spent with each of the surrogate mothers, so looking at which of the 2 mothers they spent more time physically attached to, or you can talk about when scared, so when the monkeys had purposely been put in a frightening situation, which of the 2 mothers did they seek comfort with? So that's what we're measuring. And it was found that in both conditions, the cloth mother is who they spent more time with in comparison to the wire mother. Regardless of which one had food, they would quickly go for their feed and then cling on to the soft cloth mother. Alternatively, Lorenz had very much a more natural approach, in the sense that they studied into what we call imprinting. Now, this is kind of an evolutionary idea that we form an attachment to the first moving object that we see. And we do this for survival purposes. Now, this is something that is particularly unique to the bird species. So it's not something necessarily that all mammals do. So there is issues with generalising this concept. However, Lorenz used it as a base to figure out whether or not attachment was kind of nature or nurture, and was very much looking at that innate response and the belief that we're born knowing how to attach. So in the study, again, you need to know the IV and the DV. So the IV was whether the clutch of geese eggs hatched in front of their natural mother, so the control group, or if they hatched in front of Lorenz himself, and that was the experimental group. And then when they all hatched, and they were given like a little coloured tag around the ankle so they could see which geese came from which original condition, they simply measured, so the DV is who they followed. They looked, once they had hatched out of the egg, who was the initial mother that they followed? Was it their biological mother, or was it Lorenz? And it was found that whichever group they followed who was the first moving object they saw. So the geese from the incubator who hatched in front of Lorenz followed Lorenz and followed him everywhere as though he was their mother goose. And then the geese that had hatched in front of their natural mother, they, as you biologically expected, formed an attachment with their traditional caregiver. That then leads into the explanations of attachment, which essentially is where you unpick why we form attachments, what are the reasons for that. And there's 2 main theories that you look at in this booklet. You've got Bowlby's monotropic theory of attachment, which is also known as his evolutionary theory, and then you've got learning theory. So Bowlby's monotropic theory is broken down into 5 key components, and we use the acronym of ASK-ME to help us identify these factors. Now, a bit of an exam tip or just general word of warning, ASK-ME is an acronym that we at college have provided to help you as a memory aid. It's not called the ASK-ME theory. So in the exam, you wouldn't refer to it as ASK-ME, you just use that as a bit of a checklist to make sure you've included all 5 elements. The actual key term you should be using is his monotropic theory. So if I talk you through the 5 parts of Ask Me really quickly, each of the 5 components help address a key question. And by writing your answer in this 5-step order, it means you've addressed all of the questions and you've got a nice natural flow to your answer. So the first thing that I would talk about for Bowlby's monotropic theory is adaptive. So this is why we form attachments. We do it for adaptive survival purposes. The S in Ask Me stands for social releases. So this answers the question of how we form attachments. So this is about responding sensitively to those kind of needs of your child. So when the caregiver accurately picks up on the kind of physical social releases or the behavioural social releases such as crying and laughing, they're able to detect what the infant might need, and if they respond accurately to those needs, that's how the attachment is formed. The C stands for critical period, and that refers to when the attachment is formed. So in the critical period, that's between birth and 2 years, so kind of the first 2.5 years of life, and that is when the attachment to our primary caregiver should be formed. If it's formed outside of that critical period, there are some significant problems, and we'll look at that when we do maternal deprivation. The last 2 components then, the M and the I, refer to monotropy and the internal working model. So monotropy answers the question of who we form an attachment to. So if we break that word down of monotropy, mono meaning one, this is referring to a single primary attachment to one significant caregiver, and this is usually the biological mother that Bowlby found was the main primary caregiver in most cases. Now the internal working model kind of also answers the question of why we form an attachment, but it brings it all together because the internal working model is known as a template or a blueprint for future relationships. So this allows us to identify, based on our experiences, what we should expect from a relationship, how we should expect to be treated, and to know what is expected of you as an individual. So if you've had a positive experience in early attachment, you then carry that knowledge and behaviour and utilise that in your adult relationships. That is very much what I would say is a nature perspective of behaviour. So if you think about the topic of issues and debates, one of them being nature versus nurture, Bowlby's monotropic theory is nature. The idea that we have an innate drive to form an attachment and we do it kind of for survival purposes. It's within us. Okay, we're born knowing how to do it. Whereas the learning theory is very much on the nurture side of the perspective. This idea that we're not born knowing how to do anything, we are a blank slate, and all of our behaviour is based on learning from the environment and the external experiences that we have. So learning theory in this context is broken down into 2 concepts, classical and operant conditioning. So this is all about using your knowledge of behaviourism to explain how we learn to form an attachment through association, based on this idea of cupboard love, that we form an attachment with the person who feeds us. So it's about creating that association between the neutral stimulus of the caregiver, the unconditioned stimulus of food, which gives a response of pleasure. When those things are paired together, every time mum feeds baby, that association is created, and over time, the caregiver alone gives that sense of pleasure even when it's not feeding time. Alternatively, operant conditioning, in the terms of positive and negative reinforcement, can be used to explain how attachment is learned. So, for example, when a baby cries when they're hungry, baby often gets fed. Normally baby's crying, eventually the caregiver will figure out it's because they're hungry and will feed them. That reinforces baby positively by rewarding them for the behaviour of crying. So the next time they're hungry, they're likely to cry again because they know it gets them food, and they continue to repeat that behaviour. Alternatively, at the same time, the primary caregiver, who is usually the biological mother, they're also being reinforced by having that negative stimuli of the crying removed. So they're being negatively reinforced, meaning the next time baby cries, they're likely to feed him because that's going to stop them crying. So either way, both parties in the relationship are being rewarded in some way, shape or form, and therefore it helps them strengthen and form and strengthen that attachment bond through that process of learning. So they learn to form that bond with each other. Now, in booklet 4 of this topic, we look at what we call the strange situation. So we've started off by saying this is what attachment is and the different interactions and stages of attachment. We've looked at ways that we can use animal studies to delve into those more socially sensitive areas that we otherwise wouldn't be able to explore. And we've tried to explain quite simply, two very opposing and different theories. In the strange situation, this is looking at kind of one famous study of attachment done by Mary Ainsworth. And this is all about being able to describe and evaluate this research method or this technique as a way of measuring attachment. So the strange situation has become that famous that this is now a standardized methodology that people use when trying to measure attachment styles. So you'll notice that the strange situation comes up again in cultural variations, it comes up in institutionalization. This same technique is used a lot within this research area. So all that you look at in booklet 4 is you look at what actually happened in the original Ainsworth study, what was being tested for, and what were the key findings or the outcomes. So in the strange situation, it was a controlled observation of which there were 8 different episodes. Now, a bit of an exam tip, a really good way to kind of memorise or learn the 8 episodes is through the use of a storyboard, kind of mapping it out and visually adding diagrams and things to help you. But making sure that you know the 8 situations in order. And in each of the situations, what you need to know is who is present. So is it just the researcher? Is it the infant, the caregiver, and are there any strangers present? So you need to know who is there and what is being tested for in that scenario. So the 4 main things that Ainsworth wanted to test for during this observation was willingness to explore, so the extent to which the infant would be willing to leave their caregiver and go and play with some of the other toys in the room and kind of explore the environment. Stranger anxiety. So how did the infant actually react when there was the presence of a stranger? Were they not bothered? Were they showing discomfort? How did they react to the presence of somebody else? The third thing that they looked at was separation anxiety. So the extent to which they would feel signs of distress when they are spending periods of time away from the caregiver. And then finally, what we call reunion behaviour. So this is measuring the reaction of the infant upon being reunited with the caregiver. So in each of the 8 episodes, you had some episodes where the mum left and a stranger came in, and then the stranger left and the baby was completely alone. And then the stranger came back and tried to comfort baby, and the mum returned. So it was this constant changing of dynamic in terms of who was present. And in each of the 8 episodes, they were measuring for kind of one of those 4 key behaviours to see what are some of the key features of attachment and are there any differences between different infants. Now, from the results of that, they kind of categorised or came up with 3 main attachment styles that most people fall into. And the 3 styles are secure, which is the most common, insecure avoidant, and insecure resistance. So a secure child is somebody whose caregiver has often met their needs really effectively. They know where they stand with their caregiver. There's a lot of trust there. They feel moderately distressed when the caregiver leaves and moderately distressed in the presence of strangers, but there's willingness to explore. They will use their caregiver as a secure base and go off to kind of, look and play and explore the environment, but they keep checking back in for comfort with their caregiver. And also they have positive experiences of reunion. They feel really happy and rewarded when they see their caregiver come back, which creates that loving environment. For the insecure avoidant children, Ainsworth found that in their study, anyone who fell into the category of avoidant typically showed minimal reunion behaviour. They weren't bothered when mum returned. Stranger and separation anxiety was relatively low, and they were very willing to explore. However, they didn't use their caregiver as a safe base. They just went off and played and they didn't look back. Whereas insecure resistant children are very clingy, have a lot of anxieties and often show a lack or an inconsistent pattern of attachment with their caregiver, in the sense that they are really anxious and want to spend all their time with them, but then become quite angry and distressed if the caregiver leaves, making it quite difficult for them to be soothed and to settle, because they feel like that trust has been broken. So to give you an example, during the strange situation, there was very minimal willingness to explore. Often a resistant child would stay right by the caregiver and not want to go off and play independently. Their anxiety levels in terms of stranger anxiety and separation anxiety was very high, but upon reunion, they didn't want to be comforted, they didn't want to be picked up. There was a lot of resistance, hence the phrase insecure resistant, and a lot of resistance to that comfort, and they almost felt a sense of anger towards the caregiver. Following on from the strange situation, the fifth booklet in this topic is called Cultural Variations of Attachment. And there's only one key study that you need to look at in detail for cultural variations, and that's Van Eysendorn and Kroonenberg, which is a bit of a mouthful. It is on the spec, so unfortunately you do need to know that one. Try not to worry too much about the spelling, but it is a key name and therefore we do need to be familiar with it. So cultural variations is essentially where researchers looked at this idea that if attachment is innate, as Bowlby suggests, then surely we all should have the same attachment style. But the fact that we don't suggests there might be differences culturally in our child rearing practices and the way that we raise our children that causes this differentiation between the different attachment styles. So in Van Eysendorn and Kroonenberg's study, they conducted a meta-analysis. Now, this is a statistical technique for gathering secondary data. So what this means is they didn't replicate the strange situation personally. Instead, they looked at 32 other examples, so 32 other variations of the strange situation that had been done in countries across all over the world, using a range of kind of over 2,000 participants. And they wanted to see, looking at the findings of those other studies combined, what were some of the main takeaway messages, what were some of the key findings and the most common attachment styles that came up, particularly looking at the difference between a more Western individualistic culture versus kind of non-Western collectivist societies. So the main thing that you need to remember from Van Eysendorn and Kroonenberg study is kind of the three key percentages or the three key findings, and then think about how we can explain that through different child rearing practices. So for Van Eysendorn's study, one of the key facts is that secure was the most common across the world. In every country, it was still the most popular attachment style, and it was the highest in the UK, with 75% of people in the UK falling under that secure attachment category. Which also kind of mimics what was found in the original strange situation. So in the original strange situation, 70% was secure, 15% avoidant, 15% resistant. So it shows clearly, no matter what culture we're doing this in, there is a dominant attachment style that is present. Another key factor is that out of the insecure styles, insecure avoidant was most common in Western cultures, particularly in West Germany. Now, when we think about the child rearing practices or the reason why that might be the case, One of the explanations for this is that at that time, particularly in West Germany, there was a strong preference for independent children. So the German people wanted to raise their children to be really independent, to be very obedient to authority. They didn't want fussy, clingy children, so they very much valued independence and promoted that as part of their parenting style, which can often explain, as Grossman identified, why there might be a higher proportion, 35% to be exact, of avoidant children in that particular culture. Whereas for insecure resistant, the highest percentage was in Israel, so in a more collectivist, non-Western culture. And again, some of the explanations for that linked to, at the time, a lot of people in Israel raised their children in communal settlements, in situations called a kibbutz. So in the kibbutz there would be kind of a nanny type attachment figure. So whilst the children would spend a lot of time away from their caregiver, so anxiety was relatively low, and they very rarely would come into contact with strangers. So that explains that very high stranger anxiety and that resistance upon reunion to the caregiver. Another key country that had high levels of resistance was Japan. Now this can be attributed to the concept of ame. And ame is a Japanese concept which means emotional dependence and togetherness. So a lot of the time, caregivers in Japan will be seen to kind of physically be strapping their babies to them. So when they're walking around, they're very much kind of having that contact. And therefore the amount of time they spend away from the caregiver is so limited, that explains that high level of separation anxiety from the caregiver that could be experienced in a resistant child. So on to the last three parts of this topic, in terms of booklet 6, 7 and 8. Following on from cultural variations, you've got this concept here of maternal deprivation. Now, a bit of kind of a misconception alert. Maternal deprivation is a theory by Bowlby, but this is not the same as Bowlby's monotropic theory. If you were being asked a question that required Bowlby's monotropic theory, the question would be phrased as explanations of attachment, or one or more theory of attachment, or it would actually say in the question, outline Bowlby's monotropic theory as an explanation of attachment. So if it says the word explanation of attachment or monotropic in there, it is referring to this 5 key components, the Ask Me theory. Whereas maternal deprivation, it would have that keyword deprivation in there, or it would say Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypotheses. So you need to really carefully, when you're rumbling and decoding the question, look for that buzzword. Does it say monotropic theory or maternal deprivation? Because yes, they're both by Bowlby, but they are basically opposing theories. One is about the explanation of how and why we form an attachment. Maternal deprivation is, but what happens if we don't form that? And again, we use a little bit of an acronym for this to help us break down the key components. And we break this into the acronym of MCI-PI. So the first part, MCI, this is the acronym that we use to talk about the 3 key features of maternal deprivation. Now, maternal deprivation is categorised by prolonged separation from your primary caregiver during that critical period. Okay, so the MCI is a lack of monotropy during the critical period affects your internal working model. So with having prolonged separation or without forming that bond during those first 2 years of life, your template for future relationships is going to be affected. That's what we mean by maternal deprivation. The PI bit of the acronym stands for problems with attachment, intellectual difficulties, and emotional problems. So problems with attachment suggest that you are going to have issues with forming friendships and relationships in future because of your lack of internal working model. Intellectual difficulties is referring to those with significantly low IQ, in particular delayed intellectual development. So this is potentially in the range of intellectual disability or just significantly poor IQ, so very underdeveloped in that aspect of our cognition and personality. And then emotional problems has been linked particularly to something called affectionless psychopathy. So affectionless psychopathy, or being an affectionless psychopath, is somebody who doesn't experience any guilt or remorse for their actions, and they really struggle to empathise with that of others. And that particular behaviour has been linked or associated with criminal behaviour, particularly in younger people. So a good key research study you can use to help explain the problems or the effects of maternal deprivation is Bowlby's 44 Thieves study. So from that study, this was comparing those who had been put into Bowlby's care as a clinical psychologist at his clinic, either because of their emotional problems or their criminal behaviour. So there was 88 children, 44 of them were thieves, 44 of them were just there based on social and emotional well-being. And they looked at their early childhood attachment styles and whether or not they'd experienced any prolonged separation, and looked at the relationship between their early attachment and their current development and well-being. And they used a range of self-report techniques, so questionnaires, interviewing them, speaking to caregivers, for example, to really create that holistic picture. And it was found that in the Thieves group, there were 14 that were categorised as affectionless psychopaths, and 12 of those 14 had experienced prolonged separation from their caregiver at any one point. Whereas none of the thieves were categorised as an affectionless psychopath, but only a couple of them had experienced prolonged separation. So it shows that kind of correlation or link between our early attachment style and the problems that we later have, suggesting that if we don't form that attachment, if we have that separation during the critical period, it can have negative effects on us in later life. Now, institutionalisation and the Romanian orphan studies, this is arguably one of the trickier booklets, just because there's lots of key terms and lots of studies to get your head round. The main two that you should be prioritising your revision on is Rutter and Zina. So Rutter's English and Romanian orphan study and Zina's study using the strange situation. Now, that word institutionalisation is referring to any individual that has experienced time in an institution. So by that we mean like an orphanage or a care home kind of setting. Particularly, the key studies are focused on Romanian orphans. Now, this is a really good thing to bear in mind when you are evaluating your study, because you can identify that some of the studies that were done in Romania seem really drastic, or the results are very vastly different from what you'd expect. But is that because the conditions of the actual orphanages that the children were living in was so poor, so unhygienic and unclean, that it affected their physical development as well as their cognitive and emotional development? Is it more the setting that played a role in comparison to their British counterparts, or is it just that process of being institutionalised in the first place? And from these two studies of Zina and Rutter, there's kind of 4 effects or 4 key things, and again, we have an acronym. Remember, these are memory aids. You wouldn't write this in the exam. This is just something to help you remember the components of your answer. So we came up with the acronym of DIDS, D-I-D-S, standing for the 4 main effects of institutionalisation. So by being placed in that care system, what are some of the negative things that can happen to you as a result of failing to form an attachment? So the first one is disorganized attachment. And as you might identify from the name, disorganized attachment is showing an inconsistent pattern of attachment. So sometimes you are showing really secure levels of attachment, other times you're showing very resistant and high levels of anxiety. It isn't one continuous attachment style, it's a little bit all over the place. Next, you've got IQ, and again, similar to maternal deprivation, this is referring to delayed intellectual development, significantly low IQ in the range of intellectual disability. You've got disinhibited attachment, so this is all about an inappropriate pattern of attachment style, very attention-seeking behaviour in which an infant will try to seek attention, but in an inappropriate setting, often from strangers, for example, going up and hugging a stranger, and not really knowing who or what or when is appropriate to be seeking affection from others. So they have quite a troublesome time with making those connections. And then finally, you've got social skills. So Rutter is the key study out of the two, because Rutter's study highlighted this new attachment style of disinhibited. They found that the Romanian orphans, when compared to the British ones, were much lower in their IQ, so their cognitive development, but also physically in terms of their health and weight. And Rutter also looked at the role of social skills. So this is about having difficulty with peer relationships because of that lack of internal working model, struggling to make and maintain friends. Whereas disorganised attachment was identified by Zena's study, which used the strange situation to measure attachment styles, but of children that had either been institutionalised or not. And while secure was still the most common, this kind of new attachment style also emerged to show that there is a negative impact as a result of being institutionalised. And then finally, we've got the influence of early attachment on later relationships. Now, we do this booklet last because it kind of ties together everything that we've done so far and links it together. So this brings back knowledge of the caregiver sensitivity hypotheses proposed by Ainsworth, that the more sensitive you respond to your infant's needs, the better that the attachment will be, and that this continues. So something called the continuity hypotheses. So the attachment style we have in early childhood, that then influences how you are with your friends, with your romantic relationships, and then you in turn as a parent. So the more secure we are in childhood, the more that positive experience is going to be continued throughout adulthood. So there's two main ways that we can look at this, three main ways that we can look at the internal working model and this continuity hypotheses. First of all, we can use research by Kern to talk about the role that this plays in friendships. So in terms of the exam, the way the question would be worded would be outline the influence of early attachment on later relationships. If it says later relationships, you can talk about friendship, romance, or parenting. If it specifically says childhood behaviour, you can only talk about friendship. And if it talks about adult relationships, you can only talk about romantic relationships or parenting. So again, it's looking for the buzzwords and the key bits of terminology in the question to determine which parts of this booklet might be relevant. But if we start with friendship, so this is relating to childhood in terms of later relationships, this looks at friendships and the role of bullying. So Kern completed some research which identified that secure children have the best, most long-lasting friendships, and they are the least likely to be involved in bullying. Whereas resistant and avoidant children tend to struggle with peer relationships and maintaining a large group of friends. And insecure avoidant children are likely to be the victims of bullying, whereas resistant children are more likely to be the bully themselves. If we think then about romantic relationships, you can bring in your knowledge of Hazen and Shaver and their study on the love quiz. So this was a questionnaire that went out in newspapers to a large sum of participants who had to answer questions about the early attachment style, so to determine whether or not they were secure, avoidant or resistant. And then they also had to answer questions on their current relationship status and their experiences of love and adult relationships. Excuse me. And what the results showed is that the participants who identified as securely attached went on to have the most loving, long-lasting relationships. Those that were resistant viewed love as an obsession and were really infatuated with people and really struggled to maintain those healthy relationships, and often it was very one-sided. And those who were avoidant tended to report being more lonely or struggling with relationships because they experienced a lot of jealousy. They really struggled with that dynamic in a relationship, and they kind of feared intimacy, most likely because of their independent nature and them being used to being by themselves and therefore struggling to be open and sharing things with others. And then finally, if you're asked about parenting, that's where you can talk about the continuity hypothesis. So the style of attachment that you formed during childhood typically then goes on to inform your parenting style. Now, an easy evaluation for that one is to talk about how many people do the opposite, and if they've had a negative experience in childhood, often try to learn and grow from that and stop that generational behaviour by purposefully parenting in a different way. So whilst there's evidence to suggest we do continue our attachment style, there's lots of cases where we would be likely to purposefully do the opposite. And that's a whistle-stop tour of attachment. So obviously some areas are slightly easier than others. However, I want you to kind of notice that this is almost like a story, and it's about piecing it together and trying to figure out where each of these booklets fit in, because they all very much are a continuation of that same idea. So we start off by saying this is what attachment is, these are the behaviours that you need to look for, so secure-based behaviour, proximity, attention seeking, trying to identify how and why an attachment is formed. We look at the different methodology and the kind of research evidence that is out there and the different theories of the formation of attachment. With the strange situation, we look at the research methods and the kind of science behind this. So what are the key techniques that we've used to develop these three attachment styles? We compare that across different cultures. We look at what happens if we don't have that attachment and how that affects us. We look at that in an institutionalised setting, so comparing a traditional kind of household versus an alternative provision of being raised, and what the significant differences there and the practical applications we can develop to support children in different settings. And then tying it all together at the end by saying everything that we've learned feeds into our internal working model, and at every stage in our life, that early attachment does influence our later life, and it does play quite a significant role in how our behaviour is developed. So I would make sure that following up from this, you kind of go away, think about what are the relevant evaluation points that match this AO1 content, do a little bit of a RAG rating, you know, what am I most confident with, what am I least confident with, and in the run up to exams, it really is about practice, practice, practice. So lots of decoding questions, lots of essay plans, and lots of timed independent practice is going to be the most effective way to check your understanding and knowledge, and hopefully this video has just given you a little bit of a guide or an overview of where to start, and filling any gaps in knowledge that you might have had. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Comment down below if you've got any direct questions about the video, or you can send me a message on the college Instagram, or drop me an email. But yeah, hopefully that's been useful. Have a lovely evening, get yourself a cup of tea, and happy revision.